Happy New Year. I'm really hoping that you and your family had a tremendous holiday season the last 2 weeks. And more importantly, I hope you're really looking forward to a great 2014. To that end, I wanted to take a break away from our normal kind of educational pieces that we do on a weekly basis and take a few moments to share a story with you that changed my life some 16 or 17 years ago. To that end, take a minute, take a deep breath, let everything else go away for a few moments, and simply pay attention to this for a second. And I hope that it will be as meaningful for you and change your outlook for 2014 as much as it did for me some 16 or 17 years ago. With that, let me take you back and just walk you through a short story. Imagine for a moment it's a Sunday morning, 7:30 in the morning, and you're sitting on a bucket. The only thing you can hear in the background is a little bit of breeze and water lapping against the sound of metal. As you can imagine, everything's quiet. It's very peaceful. And the only thing you're really thinking about is the fact that tomorrow's your birthday and you get the day off and get a chance to just enjoy it and spend some time with your family. But in the next few moments, something happens. And this may be similar to what you and I experience from time to time in our own lives. But in that moment, at that point, you start to hear a sound that seems familiar, but you've never heard it before. And in those next few moments, you realize that the sky is entirely engulfed in Japanese zeros. Today is December 7th, 1941, and you're at Pearl Harbor. And in that moment in time, the world and everything around you entirely changes. Everything. And the only thing that you can begin to think about as you look around and everything that's going on, the bombs coming in, the machine gun fire going on, the screams that you hear, the fires that are breaking out everywhere, it's pure chaos. And in the midst of all of that, when you should be thinking about doing everything you can to exit the ship that you're on, which happens to be the USS Nevada. But the only thing in your mind is to do whatever you can to change the situation. Seems odd, but in your mind, the best way to solve the problem, because you know that if the USS Nevada sinks where it is, it will entirely block the channel to Pearl Harbor. It's possible that that could have dramatically affected the outcome of World War II, etc., simply because of the inability of the United States to use that port. In your mind, and because of the training that you've had over the last 12 years or so in the U.S. Navy, you can only think about one thing, and that's to run and do everything you can to get to the dynamo in order to push the vessel out of the channel. In doing that, however, a lot of things happen along the way. You become unconscious at one point, and others come and help and revive you and get you out of the unconsciousness, and they tell you that you've got to leave the vessel. But you ignore them, and you begin again to take off a second time for the dynamo room. In doing that, in trying to reach your destination, in trying to reach that goal, along the way, you become unconscious again simply because of the heat. Not really knowing what it was that woke you or how you became conscious again. In that moment, you almost single-handedly did everything you could in order to simply take off and go to the dynamo room and do what you could to do your part in moving the USS Nevada almost single-handedly out of the channel. In fact, the Nevada was one of the only, I think was actually the only vessel that day to make it out of Pearl Harbor on its own. Later, because of your efforts and because of everything you tried to accomplish in the moments of chaos beyond anything that most of us have ever seen in our lives personally, you would become the first Congressional Medal of Honor winner in World War II. The award was presented to you by Admiral Nimitz. And in 1992, at the 50th anniversary, in 1991, at the 50th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, you introduced then President Bush at the 50th anniversary, and later that speech would become one of the most familiar of its era, in that President Bush made the statement, to dream the impossible or to dream the possible is to simply dream the impossible. And those words began to take on new meaning and really make a difference in what it was that we were doing over the period of time in Pearl Harbor. Your name is Donald Ross. A year later, you passed away, and Donald Ross's ashes were scattered across Pearl Harbor, the waters there. He wanted to be a part of the comrades and the friends and others that almost became like family to him in the military, who had never made it out of Pearl Harbor that day. You see, what I find in Donald Ross is something very unique that I hope that you can take into 2014 and really use to make a difference in your life. You see, what I found with Donald Ross is there were 4 things that really stood out to me by watching his, just everything he did that day to attempt to do something that seemed impossible, and yet he did it. He did everything he could within his own sense of individualism to make something happen that just most of us would have looked at and just said, there's just no way that could be done. There are 4 things I learned from Donald Ross and his life. You see, Ross did more than anything on the planet. His number one thing that he taught me that day was focus. Ross had every ability to be able to do anything he wanted to do that day in the midst of all the gunfire and everything that was going on. And yet, in everything that was around him, he focused on one thing, and that was to move the USS Nevada out of the channel of Pearl Harbor. That was his focus. And for you and I, for 2014, what I would urge you to do is find that thing that is in fact what you should be focusing on, and make sure you do what you can to make it happen. The second thing that I learned from Donald Ross that day was he applied the fundamentals that he had learned over a period of time. You see, often in our world today, we believe that greatness is built in only a moment. The reality is, greatness for each of us is built daily. It's built in everything that we do, step by step, day in, day out, that ultimately allows us to understand and be a part of what we do on a daily basis. If you and I simply practice that on a daily basis, at some point in our own lives, there may be a time when we have to step up to the plate like Donald Ross did. But we can only do that as a result of learning the fundamentals. If you and I do that, if we focus on the fundamentals, we in fact can make a huge difference at some point in the history of our lives. Third, something unique I found about Donald Ross. Donald Ross simply became accountable for himself and for what was going on at that time. You know, I've learned over time, after being involved in numerous companies, starting numerous companies, seeing them go public, etc., I have learned that there are two kinds of people in this world. There are victims, and there are those who choose not to be a victim. And I'm going to urge you for 2014 to be the latter. Choose not to be a victim. Choose not to be a victim. That one thing alone will make such a gigantic difference in who you are and how you see the world. You see, Donald Ross, no one would have blamed him for simply running and removing himself from the USS Nevada, getting off the ship, and doing everything he could to avoid gunfire and everything going on. But Donald Ross knew he was capable, and he became accountable for his ability to affect the situation that day. And he chose not to be a victim. No one would have blamed him ever for getting off the ship and saying there was too much heat, there was too much gunfire, I couldn't do it, it was impossible. No one would have ever have blamed him for doing that. But at this point in history, most of us would have never have known about Donald Ross if he had not done what he did. He chose not to be a victim. He chose to be accountable and to be responsible for himself and for what he could fulfill and do that day. You and I have that same ability every single day. Every moment, every time we get up in the morning, we have a choice. We can be a victim or we can choose not to be. For 2014 and beyond, I urge you, choose not to be a victim. And the very last thing I learned from Donald Ross, in watching his life and in watching what he did, was simply he never gave up. That guy was willing to go the nth degree to do whatever it took, even after being rendered unconscious twice, to being totally, almost, lifeless on the deck of the ship, not being able to go any further, and yet, with focus and fundamentals and his willingness to be accountable, to be responsible for himself, he chose to never give up. And each day, you and I, for 2014, if we want to achieve our goals, if we want to be the best that we can be, if we want to step up to the plate in our own individual families' lives, or in our own life, or in whatever it is we're trying to accomplish as an individual, at some point we have to make a decision to not give up. No matter what the odds, no matter who tells us we can't do it, no matter who tells us we shouldn't do it, at some point, if it's meaningful to you, and if it's something that you believe will change your life, you have to make a decision to never give up. And in doing so, one day, you'll have that moment, whatever it is in your time, when you'll have the ability to take on a task like this. It could be anything. You see, every single person in life encounters your own version of Pearl Harbor. All of us have been through instances in our lives when it seemed impossible to go on, when it seemed impossible, when nothing made sense, when everything was chaos and nothing else really fit. But in some moment, when we decide to focus, to apply fundamentals, to be accountable, to be responsible for who we are, and to simply never give up. If we do those four things, you and I can make 2014 A fabulous year. A year beyond anything we ever thought was possible. And more importantly, will change the scope of our lives from now on. This is Jim with Proactive Interactions. You want to send us a note? Send it to Proactive Interactions with an S at yahoo.com. We'd love to hear from you. More than anything, I hope that you can take this short story, apply it to your own life, and make 2014 the absolute greatest year of your life. See you next time.